In the previous video, we have created a database in the cloud, and inside that database, we have created a couple of tables, which is users and authorities, and we also inserted a user details like the username is happy and his password along with his authorities, which is a right authority. Now, let's try to leverage JDBC User Details Manager to connect to this database and do authentication of the user based upon the details that we are maintaining in the database. For that, let's go to our code. The very first thing that you have to do inside your project is you have to add the dependencies related to MySQL, JDBC inside your pom.xml. So for that, I have added these dependencies. One is Spring Boot Starter JDBC and MySQL Connector Java and Spring Boot Starter Data JPA, which we will be using in the next coming videos. I have also added couple of dependencies related to LDAP. The reason is in the previous video I was showing the code inside LDAP User Details Manager. In order to see that class, you should have dependencies mentioned in the pom.xml. I missed mentioning this point in the previous video. That's why I'm stressing here again. If you want to check inside the code of LDAP User Details Manager, make sure you are adding these dependencies. And also we should add dependencies related to JDBC, MySQL and Data JPA in order to connect to a database. Once we are added these dependencies inside our pom.xml, go to application.properties and give your database details using these properties like the URL that Spring Boot application has to try to connect to the database. So you should have JDBC MySQL. Post that you should mention the host name that we have seen in the AWS, followed by the database name that we have created. We have created a EasyBank database inside our MySQL database server. So that's where I have mentioned that. And at the same time, what is a username and password. Obviously, this is one of the way to connect database, and there are many ways if you are using a production ready application where you encrypt these details and or add into environmental variables to connect a database. But since this course is focused on Spring Security, I'm just going with a simple approach where we directly mention all our credentials and details inside our application.properties. But this is not recommended if you are trying to do this in the production ready application. So post this, our Spring Boot application know which database it has to connect. Now let's go to project security config. So previously we are using in-memory user details manager, and in-memory user details manager is only useful in the scenarios where you want to demo something or your application is fine to have to store the user details inside the in-memory. The disadvantage of saving the details inside the memory is whenever you make changes to your user and you are restarting your server, the memory will act like a flash and volatile, and whatever you have initial values will be reset to those values after the restart of the application. That's where if you don't want to affect your user details change again and again whenever the restart happens, then it's always advisable to go with the JDBC User Details Manager. So for that, I'm just going to comment this method for your reference. And now I don't have to create a user because I already have users created in the database. So in this scenario, I don't need all these things like creating an user, setting that to user detail service and passing that to user detail service to the framework. In this scenario, I just have to mention my framework. I am going to use JDBC User Details Manager as my implementation of Spring Security. Go ahead and leverage that class to do authentication and authorization. For that, we just have to create a user detail service bean, and framework automatically identifies, okay, this is a user detail service that I have to use. And here we are telling we implemented user detail service by leveraging JDBC User Details Manager. So for that, we also have to pass the data source. And don't worry, this data source will be created by Spring Security based upon the credentials that we have given inside the application.properties. With this, we are good to go to use our database values for authentication. But you may be wondering how this is working all internally. If you go and see JDBC User Details Manager, our framework will call load users by username. So whatever entering I'm in the UI, that username will come here and my JDBC query will happen to the table. So if you see, this is the query that it will use to select the user details. This is the query that will run. So select username, password, enable from the table users. So since we want to go with the default implementation, we adhere to these standards and use the and created the table the same name along with the same column names in the database. So now we are good to go and use this. Now let's try to start the server in debug mode by going to the main application class and right clicking debug as Java application, and this will start the application. Now this time I will put a breakpoint inside the method load user by username here, so that I will show that framework calls this method like in the previous video where we have seen that framework is calling load user by username inside the memory user details manager. The reason is at that time we have mentioned user details service that we want to configure is in memory user details manager. But this time we said to the framework, go ahead and use the JDBC user details manager. That is the reason framework will call this method inside JDBC user details manager. Now we have everything set and ready. Let's go to the browser. In the browser, try to access the my account service. It will ask you the credentials. Now let me enter the previous credentials that we used to maintain in memory. So I'm just entering admin 12345. So it will throw bad credentials. Now I will enter correct credentials which are in the database where I'm saying happy 12345 as a credential. Now clicking on this will stop my breakpoint because now this query resulting some rows. That's the reason we stopped at this breakpoint, and you can see here this will be called by the our DAO authentication provider retrieve user. So here it will go and look what is the implementation of user detail service right now. And we said that go ahead and use JDBC user details manager by creating a bean of type user detail service. So that's the reason our DAO authentication provider will call the JDBC user details manager method and will try to authenticate. So now in this scenario, since the authentication is successful, we are showing the response provided by the my account service. With this, I'm assuming it is making sense to you guys. If you have any questions, please post in Q&A section. And in the next video, let's try to how to customize this JDBC user details manager as per requirements. Like I want to have my own table. I want to have my own column names as per my application requirement. I don't want to go with whatever naming conventions that is provided by JDBC User Details Manager. So all such requirements we will look in the next video. Thank you. Bye.